of chapters. Anyone want to take a stab at this? You know it begins in chapter 4 because you have 1 through 3. Where does it end? This one actually is one that someone should get. I'm sorry? Yeah, yep. So anyway, do you know the chapter? Chapter 4 through, remember we just began the center section. That's a good guess. Chapter 11. Chapter 12 begins, so chapters 4 through 11, all right, are one side of that inner, I'm going to call it the matting, but you're just moving inside. You move from outer to inner, chapters 4 through 11. You remember when I preached on chapter 11, I actually demonstrated this. We were at the end of chapter 11. I said, turn over to chapter 27. And we picked up at chapter 27. It was like we were still reading from chapter 11. 11 just rolled right into chapter 27 with Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and the blessings and the curses, right? Okay, so on one side, you have covenant. There's different terms, different ways, different nomenclature used, but this is covenant motivation. Moses is motivating Israel to be faithful to God, to obey God, to love God with all their heart, with all their mind, with all their might, with all their soul, to love God with all that they are. On the other side of that, you have the covenant blessings and curses, the covenant confirmation, blessings and curses, okay? So covenant fidelity, covenant consequences is how we might put it, okay? Covenant fidelity, covenant consequences. Then smack dab in the middle, chapters 12 through 26, we have the law, okay? So we have the stipulations, the covenant stipulations. I've mentioned, but have yet to like demonstrate that these covenant stipulations unfold. There's no universal agreement on exactly where the breaks are, okay? But there is general agreement. There's a lot of agreement that Moses is following the Ten Commandments. In other words, chapters 12 and 13, and I'm going to point out today 14, they really are, they apply, or they relate to, maybe would be better, they're linked with, they relate to, they expound, they apply the first, second, and third commandment. So to demonstrate this is what I don't necessarily have time to do in a sermon. If you turn to chapter 12, let's start with the first commandment. What is the first commandment? Referring to the 10 commandments or the 10 words. I refer to them because the scriptures do the words of the covenant. They're the covenant words. This is the covenant that the Lord makes with Israel as he speaks out of the midst of the fire with the preamble, the covenant, and then followed by the giving of the book of the law as we see it in Exodus. And here, this is not a second law as Deuteronomy might apply, but they're just these words of Moses expounding and applying the law given at Mount Sinai for the generation that is going to inherit the promised land. So, chapter 12 is the beginning of the exposition of these covenant words, the 10 words. What is the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before the Lord, right? You should have no other gods before the Lord. If you remember, and I know this is stretching way back, I was actually looking up some old sermons this week, and I think this goes all the way back to June. That's crazy, of 2025, of course. June of 2025, isn't that nuts? And we were just in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. Anyway, when I expounded the Ten Commandments, I pointed out that different branches of the church actually, including, not just the Christian church, but Judaism, for instance, sees these commandments differently. So, for instance, some see the first and second commandment as actually being the first commandment, and then they break some break the 10th commandment into two, for example. It doesn't really matter. I will argue that the first and second commandment are closely, like inseparably linked. They are very, 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 very closely associated, okay? So it makes sense, right? The first commandment is you shall have, if you state it in the affirmative, okay, it is you shall have the right God, all right? Not the wrong gods. No other gods, and this is not a matter of order, like no other gods before the Lord, like Yahweh's first, and then you can set up your other gods in order. No, it's there is no other except Yahweh. He is the only God. There was no other gods in his presence. He's not one in a pantheon of gods. He is the only God. Okay? So, stated in the affirmative, you have to have the right God. What is the second commandment? Well, stated in the affirmative is you have to worship him the right way. Right God, right way. Right God, right way. If you want the prohibition, it's no false gods, no false ways. No false gods, no false ways. Right? If you have the right God, you will have the right way. Or to reverse that, if you don't have the right way, you don't have the right God. These two are really, they're distinct, okay? But they're inseparable. I think that's an easy argument. I hope that most see that. That seems pretty clear. I think the harder thing to see is how the third commandment is also part of that chain. All right? The third commandment is another link in that chain. I see the first three commandments, right, as being distinct, all right, and as being primarily, so I know that most people are familiar with the two tables of the law. We're told there's two tables. The first is love God, second is love your neighbor, and they're broken up in 1 through 4, and then 5 through 10. I think a better way of seeing the Ten Commandments is 1 through 3, love for God, 4 as transitional. It's a hinge command, both requiring love for God and love for neighbor, which we'll see as we get to the fourth commandments expounded in chapter 14, verse 28 and following. And then the commandments 5 through 10 focus on love for neighbor. So in other words, that fourth commandment, that Sabbath command, is actually a hinge command that is transitional. It's transitioning from love for God to love for neighbor. Okay? So these first three are really inseparably linked. So let's move through chapters 12 through 14. Maybe the best way to do this is, let me attempt to demonstrate that this is one larger section, okay, first, okay? So you're going to need your Bibles open if you want to gain anything here, and you're going to need to follow along. Chapter 12. What is just look at the first 4 verses. What is Israel commanded to do? Destroy the altars. Yeah, destroy every vestige of the names of gods. So look at verse 3. It starts with their pillars, their objects. It starts actually with their places. On the high mountains, on the hills, under every green tree. So it starts with places, then it moves to objects, their asherim, their pillars, their carved images, and then it concludes with their name. You are to destroy their name out of that place. Okay, and so in chapter 12, he's going to go on. So I just take note of that, verse 3. They're to destroy the names of all the other gods, their names are to be utterly removed from before the Lord. Already you should hear the first commandment there. Of course, you can also hear the second commandment, since what's being removed is the places and objects of their worship as well, right? The asherim, the carved images, which they were not to make. And so then you also have the removal of their name. So I'm going to argue that you have a reference to the third commandment, even here already, that these three are inseparably linked. So chapter 12, just a very high-level overview is the removal of the names of the gods, and the anticipation of a time when God will establish or set his name in a place. And that is the place that God's people are to worship. If you remember, this was just a few weeks ago. It wasn't too terribly long ago. Verse 11, that they are to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings. So we're gonna hear the repetition of that, to the place that your Lord, your God, chooses to place his name. To that place they are to go. To that place they are to make their offerings. There is provision made for the eating of meat that is not ceremonial, if you will. But just hold on to that, to the place that the Lord will set his name. To that place they are to go to worship. Everyone sees it, right? Susan, did you? Yeah. So because of who's anti-God? Because of the peoples, the pagans that were in the land, you mean the Canaanites? Right, yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Right, yes. Yeah, no, absolutely, sister. And that's like, that even after that place is removed, the objects are removed, the name is removed, there would still be an association in the mind of the people with those gods. Yeah. So the Lord himself, he prescribes his worship from start to finish. He prescribes the place, the place, the setting of the place is already, because we have Exodus and Leviticus, it's already directly associated with the tabernacle and the whole system that's given as part of tabernacle worship, if you will. The Lord has already prescribed in great detail how people are to draw near to him, how it is that they can come into his presence and have fellowship with him, right? Okay, so chapter 12, the place, let's see, the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there. That is the place they are to go, right? Okay. If you flip over to chapter 14, you'll see that the language, and I know I read just a little bit of it, but almost all the language you find here in verses 22 through 27 is in chapter 12, right? And so, and before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, verse 23, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always, and if the way is too long for you, remember that the reason that the Lord gave them instructions on how to kill meat, pouring out the blood, for instance, in their town, it was because when he expanded their land, and if it was too far for them to go and they wanted meat where they were, they didn't want to travel all the way, he gave provision for that. Well, here there's another reference to if it's too far, here's what you are to do if it's too far. You sell, you take the money, you go to the place that he will decide, he will choose, and you purchase what it is that you desire, what you crave. See, craving also is a term, if you remember, that shows up in Deuteronomy chapter 12. And you shall eat there before the Lord, verse 26, your God, and rejoice. That was another. All these terms, all right, all these terms have already been, they're fresh in our mind, because as we're reading from or listening to Moses, he starts in Deuteronomy chapter 12, he's expounding the law, and when he gets to 14, I mean, we've just heard these things. So even as we're Israel listening to Moses, our mind is able to make that connection, actually far better than our minds are, because it's not nearly as fresh, because we're not actually listening to it all in one setting, we're not exposed to it at the same time. Anyway, the connection's there, the connection's clear. Questions on that connection? Chapter 12 and chapter 14, verses 22 through 27. You see the connection? Got the craves, rejoicing. You have the place, or the Lord your God in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there. If it's too far, just a piling up of what we had seen in chapter 12. Yep, yeah, see it, got it? All right, great. Yeah, so I'm saying that chapters 12 through 14, chapter 12, verse 1, through chapter 14, verse 27, is expounding and applying, is how I would put it, the first three commandments. And I think basically in order that, again, that it's so hard because the first and second commandment overlap so much that, some people will say that Christopher Wright, a very well-known Old Testament professor, actually argues that chapters 4 through 11 are the first commandment, and chapter 12 begins with the second commandment. Okay? I'm just pointing out that there's various ways that people will arrange this. I think that the best way to see it is understanding that this section, chapters 12 through 26, is going to move through all 10 commandments. And it's going to expound and apply them. So that here in chapters 12, 13, and 14, we are really seeing the application of those principles, those commandments, to Israel in the context of receiving the promised land and living in the promised land in that theocracy. Does that answer your question, Corey, thoroughly? Okay. So Corey pointed out, so I'm just going to go ahead and go there. Here's the other thing, is that not everyone ends, so I know it probably feels strange to end this section at verse 27, right? I do so because I believe that verses 28 through 29 are transitional. In one sense, so is 22 through 27, but 28 begins with, in the Hebrew, it begins with, and at the end of every 3 years. This is repeated in 15:1 at the end of every 7 years. And I really think 28 and 29 go with 15, and all of these go with the Sabbath regulation. What is in view here is a specific time, if you will, right? And the expounding, and we'll see it more clearly. If you remember, as I preached through the Sabbath, one of the primary purposes of the Sabbath was relief. Relief for those who were under others, right? And so Corey pointed out that we're coming up on the sabbatical year at the end of every 7 years. Before that, at the end of every 3 years. At the end of every 3 years, I think, goes with at the end of every 7 years. And we're going to move through that. We're going to also the expounding and applying the fourth commandment. You have the festivals, so we're going to see the Passover, the weeks, the booths. All of that's going to be expounded in this section that is about the fourth commandment that really extends all the way to chapter 16, verse 17. Okay, with another transitional passage there that follows. So there's some passages that come in between that I really think reach forwards and backwards. And that's why some people will put it one direction, some people will put it the other. I don't think we need to lose any sleep over it. But the cleanest way to see it is that the section that begins in chapter 12, verse 1, concludes in chapter 14, verse 27, and that those verses 22 through 27 serve as an inclusio. If there's not, I think I can make an argument there's a chiasm here, but I'm not gonna trouble anyone with that right now. So you can at least see how we've returned to chapter 12 with the language of chapter 14, verses 22 through 28. Okay? Now, there's also a verbal link. A verbal link, just referring to a word. It doesn't have to be a verb, but word, and that is, if you go to chapter 12, verse 31, each of these chapters contain an abominable thing, a reference to an abominable thing. Chapter 12, there's a reference to an abominable thing. It's found in verse 31. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. Also in chapter 13, verse 14, then you shall inquire and make search, ask diligently, and behold, if it is true and certain that such an abominable thing has been done among you. And so there's the term again. Then you go to chapter 14 and verse 3, you shall not eat an abominable thing. Okay? Same term, one time, each chapter, linking these chapters together. Okay? Linking these chapters together. All right. So, I feel like there might be one more thing, but I'm noteless this morning, without a printer and without anyone to help. So, I'm on my own. So if there is, I think that's at least enough to see. Again, there might be one other thing here. Let's go ahead and move through this section though now and see how the first three commandments are in view. The first one's really easy. Really easy. No other gods before the Lord. What is the very first thing that's commanded? Remove all other gods from before me. Right? Again, closely related, is do not worship like them. That's how the chapter actually ends. So first, remove all other gods from before me, and then I know what the other one is. Should I pause and are you guys interested in it, or should we keep moving? Yeah, go back? Okay. All right. So chapter 12 and chapter 14 are also, they show the same pattern, or chapter 14 is patterned after chapter 12. So what I mean by that is that chapter 12 is framed by this life and death theme, if you will. So the idolatry is death, and following God is life, is a major theme throughout Deuteronomy. Well, that frames the eating laws that are in the middle of chapter 12, all about eating. Chapter 14 demonstrates the same thing. It has this life-death theme at the beginning in verses 1 and 2, and it concludes with this life-death theme in verse 21, and in the middle, once again, are eating laws, right? Clean versus unclean eating laws. So we see the same pattern in chapter 12 and chapter 14 as well. Okay. All right, so chapter 12, yes. So in chapter 14, so 14 for sure has to do with fellowship, and so it is the eating laws more broadly. Yes, yeah, would be the easiest answer. I think I'll be able to give a better answer in the sermon itself. I don't want to necessarily say what I'm going to say in the sermon. Okay, so, but Pastor Jason, if you're still dissatisfied after the sermon, please let me know, and I'll. Okay, so chapter 12, it begins with removing all gods from before the Lord. So if the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me, chapter 12 says, get it done. Like, no other gods before me. I mean, literally, remove them from before me. The land is to be rid of all serpents. And it ends with, do not inquire, do not follow their ways, which, of course, leads into chapter 13. 12 and 13, this is the way I'd present it. I'm sorry, let me finish my thought there. 13 is specifically about being led astray to follow after other gods. So you have, remember, 3 laws there. Each one is a different person or persons who in some way are attempting to lead or have led others to follow after other gods. Specifically stated in each of those laws is something along the lines of, let us go after other gods and serve them in the second two instances. And so once you have that language, especially of serving, you're clearly in the realm of the second commandment, that you are not to. What is the second commandment? We asked about the first one. I didn't ask about the second. What is the second commandment? Just assume everyone knows that. You shall not bow down and serve, right? Anything. So you could just plug in there any other gods. It's not just about making idols. You're not to serve them. You are not to do as the nations do in the pursuit of service to their gods, right? Okay. And so 12 and 13, I think fairly clearly demonstrate or are associated with or related to the first and second commandment. Let me pause there and ask if anyone has questions. Does anyone not see it? Corey? Okay, please. Okay, in the Luther Catechism, first question. Okay. Okay. Corey likes the Lutheran Catechism, Luther's Catechism, with the Ten Commandments specifically. And if I'm understanding what you're saying, specifically the way that it links all the commandments to the commandment to love and fear God. Is that correct? Yeah, that's awesome. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so does everyone see it? Kinda, sorta? Okay. All right, so the chapter 14 is difficult. Now, I'm actually going to let me do this. I'm trying to figure out what I'm not going to say in my sermon. So, does anybody remember the sermon? I know this was back in June. Be really impressed with it. Do you remember anything about the sermon on the third commandment? No? Okay, but let me ask this. Is the sermon on the third commandment about not using the generic name of God in some irreverent way? See, Maya remembers that. Thank you very much. Or you already knew that, or whatever. That works. Fine. So what is the name, first of all, in the third commandment, sorry. And what are they being prohibited from doing? The language there, by the way, is, you probably don't remember this, but take is fine, it's fine, but I think we immediately think like take on your tongue. It's to lift up in or for worthlessness, futility, and so the name of Yahweh, your God, right? So what does the name convey in that context? That is the ancient Near East. Is it just like Jeff? Like Jeff's a cool name, Goff. It's actually not a cool name. It's really yeah. So Pastor Jason's saying the knowledge of the Lord. So if you go to Exodus chapter 6, for instance, you could start in Exodus chapter 4 when the Lord gives his name. But I love Exodus, the way that Exodus chapter 6, in fact, let's just go there quickly, says this. This is one of those places that I'd ask you to, like, mark, go back to again and again, when understanding the importance of this covenant name. What is communicated here is of just incredible significance. Starting in verse 2, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, that is El Shaddai. But my name, the Lord, or my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. That is by that name, all right? That doesn't mean that name wasn't known. There's evidence that the name was in some sense known, but God is saying something different here. What he's saying is that I I am giving my name to Israel in conjunction with the revelation that is about to occur through this Exodus, so that this self-revelation of God in the wonders and mighty works that he will accomplish in redeeming his people out of Israel and bringing them to himself and speaking to them from the midst of the fire. And you have to, it's not just the Exodus, like till they get into the to the other side of the Reed Sea, but it's all the way through this revelation of who God is. It's almost like the name is being filled up with God, right? And it is a name given to Israel, not just because, like, maybe someone someplace heard the name and they could say it, but it is the knowledge of this God, to know him. And I would argue it is not just to know him, but what it conveys is to be known by God. It is relational through and through. God was about to do something that was even greater than what he did in revealing himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was about to take a people who were no people, bring them out of another nation, bring them to himself, and make a nation out of one man, Abraham. And this is who Yahweh is. Now from that, Deuteronomy chapter 4, just to reinforce this idea, this is what Moses says when in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 32, he says, "For ask now the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and asked from the end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which Yahweh, your God, did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh is God. There is no other besides him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire. And you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance, as it is this day, know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that Yahweh is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. There is no other." That's the name. In other words, like the name, and this is true generally in the ancient Near Eastern context, it conveys something of the nature, character, and mission of the one named. All right? If this it just sounds completely unfamiliar to you, I usually don't do this, but I do encourage you to go back and try to find that sermon and listen to it, where I attempted to, at least, and I think I did, demonstrated this at length. Okay? So, what is in view here in chapter 14, and I'll have more to say on this in the sermon, but what is in view here is that this people, chapter 14, verse 1, are the sons of Yahweh, the Lord. By the way, that phrase is only used here in the entire Torah. Maybe the Bible. I don't know if that phrase is used anywhere else in the Bible. I know it's only used here in the Torah. Right? It's used this one time. Right? And so to be the sons of Yahweh is to bear his name. And so this is a people who are holy to the Lord, or Yahweh, their God, chosen by him, his treasured possession, and they are to bear his name, to lift up his name before the nations in a way that is reverent and with integrity, and in a way that impacts every arena of life. Again, it's what I argued when I preached on the third commandment, and that's what's in view here. The Lord is king of their kitchen. Therefore, he's king of every other sphere of life. He has separated them, therefore they are to be separate. He has removed them, therefore they are to maintain their holiness. They are to be distinct because the Lord has made them distinct. Much more to say, but that's a foundation. We've done some spade work, and we need to pray. Gracious Father, Lord, thank you for, from the beginning, calling people out and to yourself. Father, we thank you that when mankind dwelled in darkness, you did not abandon us in our iniquity and our sin, but you have been the God from the very beginning who calls people out of darkness and into your marvelous light. Just as you called Abraham out of Ur, just as you called Israel out of Egypt, so you have called us out of the domain of darkness into the kingdom of your beloved Son. Oh, gracious Father, would you help us to understand the weightiness, the beauty, the joy of being removed from the world and having friendship with you. Oh, Father, would you help us to value our fellowship so much with you that we would not be tempted to have friendship with the world. Oh, gracious Father, would you help us, Lord, to worship you in spirit and truth this morning, we ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen.